For more on NATO and Canada's role, I'm joined by Stephen Saideman. He holds the Patterson Chair in International Affairs at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. You've said in the past that NATO hangs by a thread and that you're pessimistic. Why?
Because the heart of NATO is the commitment for each country to defend every other country. An attack upon one is equal to an attack upon all. But there's nothing automatic about that. It requires political decisions in the national capitals and at NATO headquarters. And that these days relies on a decision made by Donald Trump, who has been very, very skeptical about NATO. And so I could easily imagine a circumstance where there's some aggression in the East and the U.S. does not respond. And if the U.S. does not respond, that puts everybody else out on a limb.
Now, we've heard a slightly different tone, though, from the U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Mattis.
Yes, James Mattis was once SACEUR, which meant he led NATO. And as a former general, he is more multilateral than the average Trumpster. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that Mattis has proven thus far to be on the outside of this administration, that he was not involved in the decision to ban immigrants. And that had a lot of military equities, that the Defense Department has a lot of interest in that issue because of a variety of reasons, including the fact that the United States is currently involved in a war in Iraq. And the Iraqi response to that decision was potentially to get rid of all American contractors in Iraq, and those are fundamental to the war effort.
Let's talk a little bit about why you think NATO is a target, in a sense. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not just Donald Trump. There are others who look at institutions like NATO with some skepticism now and wonder if it's not sort of a body of another time. Does NATO run the risk of sort of the kind of institutional kind of disregard that many people hold now, that same sort of political wave that we've seen in Europe?
Well, I do think that the far right that is ascendant in both the United States and in Europe is skeptical of all institutions. Mm-hmm. And is skeptical of multilateralism. So we see a lot of attacks on the EU, and we saw that with Brexit, and we've seen that with a lot of other efforts in Europe. And Trump is, in some ways, part of that larger movement of being skeptical about these institutions. And part of this is being funded by Russia, that Putin has been funding far-right movements that are opposed to NATO because one of his key policy objectives is to break NATO. And so that's where my concern is that he might launch some sort of aggression towards one of the Baltic countries, hoping that NATO fails to respond, which then leads to the end of NATO. Because if the promise to defend an ally isn't met, then what point is there to the alliance?
But at this point, NATO does have a plan to put troops in 4 of the Baltic states, and Canada's part of that.
That's right. That this was one of the big reliefs from last summer's Warsaw Summit, that there was a promise to move beyond just exercising. The previous effort was to avoid any kind of sense of permanence. But the fear I had and others had was that, on a given weekend, maybe there are no American or British or German or Canadian troops because of some rotation, some vacation, some whatever. But now there's going to be a permanent presence. But Canada is not getting there until May or June. The Americans moved quickly because Obama made the decision to move quickly before Trump became president. But one could imagine that in the normal sequence of events where the United States has to rotate the current troops out and put another set of troops in, you might see Trump delay that. And then there's an opportunity. And so I worry about that kind of opportunity.
The other issue for the Trump administration is the whole issue of other countries have to pay up. They have to pay their fair share. You've argued that, in fact, a percentage of GDP, the 2% requirement, isn't the right way to measure this. How do we measure our defense spending in terms of?
Well, I think the 2% promise, and the promise is not a ironclad promise.
Right.
The promise was an aspiration to reach 2% someday. It's in some ways unrealistic because it would require Canada and other countries to essentially double their defense budget, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. I think that NATO countries need to measure not just percentage of GDP, but what do you do? Because in the 2% measure, Greece looks great because Greece spends more than 2%. But Greece in any major NATO mission has not shown up in any kind of way. They had like 20 or 30 guys in Afghanistan based in some headquarters. That was doing a token effort and had no impact on the mission, whereas Canada had almost 3,000 troops, lost 158 soldiers and plus some civilians, made a major effort, made a major contribution. And so while all politicians have short memories, and obviously Trump's memory is far shorter than most, it's the doing that matters. And so there needs to be some discussion at NATO headquarters about how to talk about the doing and the spending, because both matter. Canada's continuing underspending is a problem because it makes Canada less ready. And that's the real important thing. It's not so much about reaching 2%, but the trade-offs we face means that our soldiers and our sailors and our pilots are not flying as much as they should be, not sailing as much as they should be. Their equipment might not be as good. The United States faces the same problem, that because of sequestration and budget problems, something like 2/3 of the Marines' planes can't fly. So that's a real issue about readiness. But what's happening right now, it's really a political thing where countries are complaining about burden sharing. Mm-hmm. And so the pushback Canada can have is we've borne more than our share of the burden. It was just measured in blood, not in dollars. And there should be pressure to have for countries to spend more money on defense because the need is arising with Russia's aggression. But we should not be exerting threats. The United States, at this moment in history, where you have a very skeptical president who has talked about the obsolescence of NATO, who is the most pro-Russia president in American history, issuing threats of making NATO seem like a protection racket. Well, if you don't spend the money, then maybe something bad happen to you, and that's really a problem.
So how do you counter that? I mean, apart from countries stepping up and being more ready, spending more money, how do you counter that? It's a political sentiment as much as anything.
Well, I think Canada's doing a good job of in this meeting that Saideman just had in Europe, pointing out the list of things that Canada's currently doing. Canada has got troops headed to Latvia. Canada is training the Ukrainians. Canada has a training mission in Iraq. That Canada keeps showing up when necessary. And I think that Canada did a very good job in massaging Trump last week, in finessing the difficulties, in pandering to his ego, in elevating Ivanka. All these things were important for creating a mood, because for Trump, it's not about the realities of the world, but of really making him feel good about things. And I think we're doing a good job of that, and we need to keep on doing that.
Thanks very much for your expertise.
My pleasure, Alison.